Continuing our reading in Yellow Eyes by Rutherford Montgomery. Today is chapter 14, The Yellow Killer Turns. Yellow Eyes returned to those haunts familiar to him. He prowled and killed, ranging down almost to within sight of Cougar George's cabin. The hunter discovered one of his partly eaten kills and set about to rid his district of the yellow slayer. He gathered his pack of hounds and put them upon the trail of the big cat. They set out eagerly, and Cougar George followed upon his horse. The pack came upon Yellow Eyes after a 3-hour run on his trail. Yellow Eyes was sleeping in a thicket. He slipped away before the hounds at a long lope. Outdistancing them, he circled and lay on a ridge. The pack swept by his hiding place and went yelping up the slope with the hunter close behind him. Yellow Eyes crossed a rocky canyon and entered a dense growth of spruce. From there he headed straight up toward the snow line. His pace was even and tireless, for within him was the sure knowledge that the dogs could not overtake him. Weary and disgusted with darkness settling, Cougar George faced homeward after calling in the pack. He was determined to take up the trail the next day and to follow it to the end. This would necessitate loading a pack horse with food and blankets. He set about making ready for the chase, and soon had his supplies in order, awaiting an early start. That night, Yellow Eyes killed a buck and feasted. He gorged himself until he was heavy with warm meat. Then he lay down and slept peacefully. His sleep lasted well into the next afternoon. He was awakened by the baying of the pack upon his trail. He sat up and snarled deeply. With deliberate strides he walked to the edge of the thicket where he had made his bed. A steady breeze coming up from the valley below carried the yelping of the dogs to him. He set off at a lope, anger stirring within him. He had been disturbed before he had finished his sleep. Before dark that night, the pack had closed in twice. Each time the king cat had leaped away and outdistanced the dogs in a mad dash along the slope. For a short run, the big killer was a marvel of speed. His leaps covered 20 feet, and he volleyed along like a tawny projectile. Back on the trail, Cougar George grew sullen and angry. The king cat was not acting as he should. He was not taking to a tree at the end of each mad dash. Cougar George looked at the deep tracks in the leafy mold where Yellow Eyes had landed after an unusually long leap. He sure is a whopper, he muttered. His hide'll bring $100, and he'll sell his beauty too. Night forced a halt upon the pursuing pack, but Yellow Eyes kept on for hours. Finally he stopped and rested. He selected a rim from which he could test the wind off the back trail and where he could hear the hounds should they run that night. A vigil of several hours convinced him that he was not being followed. He slid from the rim and hunted a while. He did not realize that he should have been sleeping during the night, because the hounds would take the trail at daybreak to cling persistently to it all day. Just before dawn, he lay down and went to sleep. The pack awakened him before noon. The wind had shifted and his scent blew down to them. They left the trail they had been following and headed straight toward his hiding place. Cougar George was riding up a ridge below. He saw Yellow Eyes break cover and leap away before the dogs. His eyes sparkled with surprise at the size of the king cat, the biggest brute he had ever trailed. He was unable to jerk his rifle from its saddle holster and shoot before the yellow killer flashed into cover. Yellow Eyes ran downhill for a mile before he slackened his pace. This was his way of making a hasty exit. Going downhill increased his speed because it gave him added distance on each leap. Doubling back, he headed uphill again and raced for another mile before he slackened his pace. At this point, any ordinary cougar would have taken to a tree, but Yellow Eyes had no desire to hide in the branches of a tree. He knew that he was master of the pack as long as he fled before them and stayed on the ground. Swinging around a shoulder of rock, he ran along a ledge at the foot of a towering palisade of rim rocks. The piled and littered ledge made the running difficult, but he leaped over the larger boulders, picking his way rapidly. From the edge, he climbed up a crevice and out on top of the rim. His course then led him around a bend in the wall and out to a point. He had been working toward this lookout for some time. On a flat shelf of granite, he lay down and watched the country he had just quitted. Presently, he saw the pack below. They were coming out on the rocky ledge, along which he had loped so easily. The dogs had trouble getting over the larger boulders. They could not leap over them and had to scramble around the obstructions. Cougar George arrived on the ledge after the dogs were well across. He could not make his horse follow the dogs. Yellow Eyes saw him dismount and hitch his horse. The hunter pulled his rifle from its scabbard and set out after the dogs on foot. The pack soon left its master far behind. Yellow Eyes heard them leap into the crevice and begin scrambling upward. He did not move, though they were now nearer his watchtower. His eyes were upon Cougar George, moving along below at a slow pace. The dogs broke out on top of the ledge with eager yelps. Yellow Eyes raised his sleek belly from the rock and faced about. His amber eyes shone with a yellow light, and his ears were laid back. He leaped to a boulder and flattened himself upon it. The leader of the pack swept around a clump of juniper and sprang forward. Yellow Eyes sprang from his perch straight upon the dog. His powerful breastbone struck the hound, a crushing blow, and one forepaw lashed out, ripping the dog's side with deadly claws. The hound staggered away from the king cat. In that instant, Yellow Eyes struck again and sent the leader of the pack hurling from the cliff. The other dogs came up yelping and barking. Below on the ledge, Cougar George knew his dogs had come upon the king cat and that the big fellow had made a stand. Thinking the cat had taken to a tree, he slackened his pace to recover his breath. Yellow Eyes met the pack on the narrow ledge leading to the shelf where he had lain watching the back trail. Lashing and ripping, he hurled the dogs from him as they leaped in. His tawny rump was low on the ground, while his powerful front legs struck out like rapiers of gold. 3 dogs were hurled mangled and bleeding into the back trail. The rest of the pack backed off, whining with surprised fear. This was not the sort of mountain lion Cougar George had trained them to expect. This big fellow was a lashing, snarling demon. Yellow Eyes lifted his dripping jaws and blew the bloody foam from them. His broad chest swelled, and he sent a mad, piercing scream ringing down the mountain. There was a note almost human in that scream. Treon, setting a rabbit snare in the next canyon, heard it and straightened from his task. His wind-bronzed face lightened as the wild blood within him answered the mad challenge of the king cat. The yellow killer had at last turned upon those who persecuted him. Treon smiled softly and again bent above his snare. Cougar George heard the cry, and it chilled him. He realized that something had gone wrong. Jerking the safety free of his rifle, he scrambled up through the notch. Yellow Eyes leaped straight at the remnant of the pack. With wild yelps, the dogs broke and fled along the back trail. The king cat did not chase them far. At the first stand of spruce, he vanished into deep cover and loped away down the slope, knowing that he was no longer being pursued. Cougar George met his fleeing dogs and shouted to them. They halted and slipped to his boot heels. He noted grimly that there were but 3 of them, the 3 poorest trailers in his pack. He strode ahead and came to the bodies of the 3 slain hounds. His eyes glistened and glittered angrily as he gazed upon the torn carcasses. Stepping to the edge of the cliff, he looked down to where the leader of the pack lay motionless and battered upon the rocks below. "Killer, sure enough," he muttered. There was admiration in his voice in spite of his anger. "We have a job ahead of us." He turned and without another look at the slaughtered hounds walked away, the 3 remaining members of the pack following close upon his heels. That night Yellow Eyes did not hunt. He lay down and waited beside the trail. A cougar has unlimited patience and can lie unmoving in one spot for hours. Yellow Eyes stayed in that spot, as still as the rock upon which his belly rested, until dawn the next morning. The victory had made him savagely eager to meet the other three dogs. His cunning had sharpened, and he had learned another valuable trick. He saw now and knew that he must lead the pack ahead of Cougar George and his deadly rifle. Once the hounds were out in the lead, he could attack them and master them. Cougar George returned to the cabin and sat down with his stub pencil to report the destruction of his pack of trail hounds by the yellow demon. He candidly told his superior that much trouble lay ahead for the department before the King Cat's end could be brought about. He admitted that he had met his match at last. Yellow Eyes hunted and killed unmolested for weeks. Cougar George was busy getting together another pack of dogs and did not trail him any more. The fall deer season came with its 4 days of blazing guns and madly fleeing mule deer bucks. The big cat crossed the slope after 2 days of this unusual noise and man presence. On the far slope he found more hunters, more blazing guns, and more camps. Turning back, he sought the cave where he had lifted and lived with the Golden One. It was the first time he had been in the cave since the destruction of his family. He trotted back to the empty bed where his babies had been born and nosed the pallet. A deep snarl rose in his throat and his tail lashed uneasily. The smell of those little bodies still clung to the dry grass and pine needles. With it was the mingled scent of the Golden One. Yellow Eyes turned back to the entrance of the cave and lay down. For 2 days he lay there watching the country below. He saw men on foot, mounted men, and men leading pack horses with bucks strapped upon them pass beneath his lookout. They moved aimlessly across the open meadows, and the green spruce swallowed them up. Then peace came to the high country. The bucks became less wary and fed at dawn and at dusk in the meadows. The rotting carcasses of those slain and not found were stripped by magpies and coyotes. The does began to drift downward with their fawns beside them. Again the high country took to itself. Gorgeous robes, the aspens for a day, the scrub oaks for a week or more. The air became snappy with frost whitening the ground at night. Yellow Eyes hunted restlessly. He traveled a great deal, and his kills were far apart. Then the lash of the first storm laid icy welts across the ridges and sealed the earth in a white for another winter. The great King Cat faced the storm, challenging it, daring it to sweep him from the ledge where he stood. He sent a wild scream hurling down the wind, the cry of the King Cat, lonesome, yet fierce and savage. Treon heard that cry, and his mouth tightened. He knew that the great cat was eaten with loneliness and hate for the forces he fought. Treon knew that Chimbika faced powers greater than he. An instinct told Yellow Eyes he was the last of the yellow hunters to roam that mountain. Not since the Golden One had died had he scented another of his kind. The determined effort of the predatory animal department to exterminate his kind was almost successful. And that's the end of chapter 14.